It's my great pleasure to welcome everybody on the Zoom here today and in the room. Leo, thank you, to the monthly Green Cities talk of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization on the materials that you've received. There's a list of learning objectives for those who are architects seeking continuing education credits. The methodology is self-report. The learning objectives described should be adequate to garner those. And if it seems like I'm filibustering until other people join the room, I am. But most importantly today, as many of you know, is World Cities Day. World Cities Day brings Urban October to an end. It's also the end of the AIA's Arctober. I guess it's also Halloween, auspicious day on many, many counts. But World Cities Day was first celebrated back in 2014, slightly different theme each year. This year's global observance takes place under the theme Act Local to Go Global, which bridges different partners and diverse stockholders, bringing them together to share experiences on approaches to local action, and more specifically, where local action has worked and what is needed to empower local and regional governments along with local communities to create greener, more equitable and sustainable cities. So it's altogether appropriate that as we have gone for the last almost 2 years to different cities around the world, that we come back to where we started here in New York today to talk about acting locally to think globally. And to do so, we are very, very honored to have with us today as our guest speaker, Mimi Huang. Mimi co-founded nARCHITECTS with Eric Bunge back with a belief that architecture is an agent of positive change, responding to and connecting people with the environment in all sorts of different ways, some of them expected, some of them unanticipated, responding to our world in flux while fostering social engagement guides her work. Mimi was born in Vietnam and trained in Amsterdam and in New York City. She brings a global outlook and an obsession with greenery. I'm not sure obsession is the right word, but a keen attention and capability to bringing nature into her projects and to the firm's design culture. Mimi teaches graduate design studios as an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. And she's previously taught at Yale and been a visiting critic in many other schools. Her Master of Architecture degree is from Harvard's GSD, and her Bachelor of Science previously in Art and Design came from MIT. And I should add that Mimi was a keynote speaker this year for the New York City Architecture Biennale. We did that together in this room where I'm speaking now at Columbia. And it was both a pleasure and perhaps an imposition on Mimi to say that given how well received that talk was, we would have a chance to reprise it today to conclude World Cities Day and focus attention on the projects, particularly in New York, that have distinguished her work and that of her firm. Mimi, I could go on and on about the things that have made the firm special in New York, including, I think, where we and Eric, you and I and Eric first met as a function of the project that became known, that is now known as Carmel Place, which won the competition for micro-unit housing that was announced by several different city departments, including the Department of City Planning. That project has been an exemplar not only of how micro-units smaller than previously permissible housing unit size can be built, but also how modular housing would be built. But if you're going to be talking a little bit more detail about the project, I won't steal that thunder. It's just such a pleasure to have you here. Without further ado, we'll save time for interactive discussion at the end, but without any further introduction, I'll turn the floor over to you to share your screen and talk a little bit about your current work and things that might be in the offing. Thank you again, Mimi, for being here.
Thank you, Rick. I just rebooted my computer just in time, but just warning, it might happen again. It just randomly started to reboot on me. Thank you so much for having me. So I am one of two co-founding partners of nARCHITECTS, and we
put this on. Does it bother you?
We've been in practice since '99, and currently, I would say the majority of our work is for city or state agencies, and most of our work are buildings in the public realm or civic realm. And in addition to that, we are very invested in housing and trying to do more in terms of housing. So let me share my screen. This is, can you see a PowerPoint? Okay, so as Fred mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work in New York. We are very concerned with how our buildings sit in landscapes and about how we look at deep contexts to understand what should shape our designs and how should they shape our designs. And we are obsessed with the seamless integration of buildings into their landscape. But I also have been reading a lot recently, mainly works by women and minority writers, and just trying to materialize what the personal motivations behind our work is, and also reflecting on how I teach, how I practice, and how I communicate our ethics to society at large, and uncovering the ways in which, we have been biased in how we practice and how we teach. So the talk is kind of like a retroactive manifesto, and is also a kind of roadmap towards our future, and asking ourselves, how do we respond to this moment in time? And how can architecture become an agent for positive change? And so the first project is about a search for form through a deep understanding of site. And by that, I mean the physical, hidden, historical, and social context of our site. This is the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center. It's in central New York. It's the Finger Lakes region of New York, in a small town called Auburn. This is a region that has been central to the struggle for equal rights, for the women's suffragette movement, and for the LGBTQ rights. And so our readings into central New York's history led to readings about the Great Migration and the Underground Railroad. And what struck me in these books, particularly Harlem is Nowhere, is the way in which these individual narratives and the embodied intimate voice are woven between much broader historic frameworks that really clarified for us the need to do really deep research into the communities for which and with whom we design, which is not for a universal public or a homogeneous community, but for bodies with specific narratives and motivations that stem from their local or their migrant context. So this is our site for the New York State Equal Rights Heritage Center. It was a surface parking lot that everybody was very attached to, but there was also a lot of anxiety about this project.
All right, so Dana, let's start with some of the basics of DIY cost thinking. What sort of framework?
So it was a historic site, and the first municipal building that the town built in 40 years. So a lot of anxiety. And what you can also see is that it sits in this very pivotal site with these historic buildings around it, the Westminster Church in the background, William Seward's house to the left. He was the Secretary of State for Lincoln. It started as a visitor center, a humble visitor center, but then as we started working on the project, New York State Parks realized that this area is incredibly rich, and they wanted to celebrate the legacy and expanded it to be the center for equal rights. So not just a kind of local context. And so we had two contexts, the past and the present, the built and the social. This is how we start. We call it our landscape of inefficiencies, as we start to search for a formal and urban typology that synthesizes the contemporary and historic context into something more open and participatory. All of the houses on the street of the center are all historic manors, Neo-Georgian, Federal, Neoclassical. And so we took some time to look at all of those, look at their volumes and how they break down their volumes into smaller sub-volumes. Just, you know, it was a challenge because they are all residential, whereas we were designing a new institution. So how do we reconcile the domestic typologies on the street versus the new center? And so we organized the project into 3.5 volumes that kind of hinge and pivot open in order to create these view portals to the surrounding site. You can see William Seward's house page down, and the historic city hall page right, and the parking garage that nobody liked page north. And so this is the context. You can see all of those historic manors and the way in which the project kind of sits and opens itself up to the surrounding context. It's organized in terms of these volumes, and within each volume is the core of fixed program, mechanical, bathrooms, etc. So that the exhibition is a meandering exhibition around the cores. And the idea is that, you know, as you meander around, you get these glimpses of the exhibition as well as the views outside. The exhibition is organized in terms of themes and different moments, different custom moments that try to connect the exhibition to the present. So this is the first part of the exhibition, the vestibule. Upon entry, you realize that the building is actually a portal to all of the other historic sites in and around the area, including Harriet Tubman's homestead. Upon arrival, you can go left or right around the cores. We're going to hang a left. This is the first piece of the exhibition, a kind of digital map on the right, and this bench, which is actually the actual bathymetry of one of the Finger Lakes. And this is one of the ways in which we're always trying to connect what happens inside our buildings with a broader context. I can't remember which lake this was, but it's one of them. And then you see William Seward's house in the background. And then as you keep going, this is what we call the speech island. We found historic speeches. And so these are the recordings of historic speeches. Where we couldn't find the recording of the historic speech, we involved the community, school children and members of the community to re-record the speech. And so this is a way in which we are trying to include the voices of the community in the retelling of the past. And then if you keep going, this is the social justice table. It's a timeline inside, a digital timeline, and then an interactive component. And then from here, you are looking out at William Seward's house. And then this is that same area from the outside looking in. So this is what I mean by these portals that open up to the town. And then this is looking from the other side of the building. And you can get a sense of this indoor-outdoor views that we're interested in, because you can see William Seward's house beyond the indoor space that you're looking at right now. And that same space from above. The other context that we were addressing is the culture of brick. Harriet Tubman supported and employed the indigent African-American community at her brick factory in Auburn. They crafted the bricks that clad the numerous structures on her homestead and beyond. And so we looked at all of the historic brick manors, and we replicated some of the historic detailing, but in a contemporary way. So you can see here that the structural concrete is the finish of the walls on the inside. Partly to do with speed of construction. We had to meet somebody's ribbon cutting deadline, but also because we're interested in a kind of stripped down architecture where we reduce layers, we reduce material, and we simplify the construction sequence. This is Harriet Tubman overlooking the plaza, which has become a kind of outdoor living room for the community. And you can kind of see some of the detailing of the what we call brick shutters, which we we're inspired by some of the historic manors. So since we finished this project, it really has become Auburn's living room. Many gatherings, performances, school groups, outside stakeholder groups, different formal performances, rehearsals, protests. This is Black Lives Matter. So for us, and this is, what we are extremely proud of, that the town really turned out to use this building. And so for us, form is not abstract or isolated, but it's a conversation about spaces with the community that are meant to be accessed and appropriated by them. And form and context for us are far from neutral. So then in the next project, we are exploring the reciprocal relationship between architecture and landscape. With the rise of climate activism and Greta Thunberg's generation, our briefs have expanded to consider the impact of buildings on human, plant, and animal ecology. Can buildings touch the earth with lighter footprints? Can they transform gray or brown sites into green? Eco-anxiety is a thing. It doesn't just impact the young, it cuts across age, ethnicity, and political spectrums. Apparently, almost 3/4 of us experience some degree of anxiety over climate change, and it has entered the therapy room. I have found refuge in climate and ecofiction, which can realign our ideation of nature and reveal the inequities of our collective rights to it. I've read urgent calls to action to connect the planetary scales of climate change to the human scale of communities that bear its consequences. After I read the overstory, I felt incredibly guilty using wood. And I think that it's hard to act sometimes because we are the agents of climate change, but we can also be the agents for better stewardship of our environment. And so our ethos in practice can be summarized with do more with less. Less material, less weight, less negative consequences for the environment. This is the Jones Beach Nature and Energy Center. I hope you get a chance to visit. It was the only job site during construction that was allowed to continue because they deemed it an essential site. It is on the southwestern end of Jones Beach. Very beautiful. It is part of some positive aspects of Robert Moses' legacies because it sits on this barrier island that was meant to protect the mainland and the public beaches, and this western end, which has a lot of sensitive habitats. So this parking lot, we ended up chopping out 1/3, the front third, or page right. And was this existing Moses, it was actually SOM from the 60s, bathhouse. And it looks very different from the East End. It's extremely beautiful, natural habitat everywhere. And so this is our new site plan. The parking lot used to come up to this line, page down the path. We removed over a third of it, and used the concrete rubble to elevate the building above the floodplain, while we were also reusing the existing piles. And this project started as a renovation of that existing bathhouse, but then and this is again for New York State Parks, but they also found a second funding source, which is the local power authority. And so what started as two separate centers, one about nature and the other about energy, we worked with the client to help them define their goals, and help them kind of see the synergy between energy and nature and how we can have this conversation together. Thereby shrinking the footprint of the building to what they could afford, also by introducing some shared resources, shared rooms, etc. And this is often, a conversation that we have with clients that, in terms of their construction costs, how to shrink the footprint, how to, optimize spaces, and how to reduce the amount, how we sit on the land and the impact on it. So in this case, we were able to reuse most of the piles, and sorry to go back and forth, but we ended up increasing the length of the building a little bit, but not the depth, because of the floodplain. We had to keep the building exactly where it was, and to raise it on the existing rubble. So here you see that the project is organized around fixed volumes, which are the low volumes, and then the exhibit, which have the sawtooth roof. And this is a cut through the lobby entry sequence. So upon arrival, you will see the outdoor classroom, which is what you see in this model. So this side is the side that faces the beach. And the outdoor classroom is important because this is a center for the public and for school children, mainly elementary school ages. They designed an entire nature program around this building for school visits. That was the model. This is in reality, that's the outdoor classroom. And you can also see this kind of wraparound trellis, which was also important, one for shade, two to really capture people off of the bike trails, and to invite them to sit on this porch. And third, because a lot of the exhibit is actually outdoors, with these plaques on the railings overlooking the areas of sensitive habitat. So this is the feeling of that outdoor porch. We get a lot of visitors just, hopping off of their bikes, because this is along the bike trail, and just hanging out. We wanted it to feel like a very public beach lodge kind of building. This is the view from the entry. And what you see immediately upon arrival, because the building was elevated 7 feet up, now you see the beach. Before, you couldn't see the beach from the building. But what you also see upon arrival is on page right, the exhibit about the net zero performance of the building. So this was a kind of poster child project for then Governor Cuomo's climate initiative. This is the first project under that climate initiative. This is the long gallery that connects the individual galleries, and it runs alongside that outdoor porch so that you always have this kind of glimpse of the beach as you are viewing exhibits that are about the beach. The natural daylight works so well that during the opening, we didn't have power yet, but nobody noticed because the daylight was really, really good in the building. This is for us a project where the climate considerations, wind, sun, sea levels literally shape the architecture and the identity of the center. Climate for us is not just another layer of requirements or a checklist, but it is very much a conceptual driver that impacts the morphology of the building and the experience of the architecture. And on this project, our collaboration with the client is an example of how we hope to rethink institutions and the capacity of architecture to encourage us to be better stewards of the environment. So we've also been exploring alternate models for working and living, which are connected to broader city initiatives that seek a more equitable city. The past few years have exacerbated the social, technological, and economic inequities for the working class. We have been interested in spaces for production and real manufacturing, not the laptop crowd. And so this is the Made in New York campus at Bush Terminal. This is for NYC EDC. And it is on the Brooklyn waterfront in Sunset Park. It is just south of Industry City, which is what the EDC explained to us exactly what they don't want to do. They don't want to cater to more laptop crowd workers, but they really need to try to keep more manufacturing in the city. And they are focused on fashion, because at least there is some small part of the fashion ecosystem that can still be done in the city. This is the Bush Terminal campus, circa 1900, 1905. When it was built, it was revolutionary for as an intermodal shipping, storing, and distribution warehouse hub, very much dependent on rail and water. Slowly, as the port moved from the Brooklyn waterfront to New Jersey, and with the introduction of air freight, the buildings that sit on the piers slowly started to disintegrate and literally fall into the water. And so this is now our opportunity that the two rectangles are the two buildings that we are renovating, and we're also working on the small public realm around those buildings, that these workers are predominantly Asian and Latino, because most fashion schools in the US do not teach you how to sew, they teach you how to create a brand. And so fashion companies are having a very hard time finding skilled workers. And so this is part of trying to support those manufacturers. This is a photo of the building, the historic photo. So you can see that it was never meant for workers. It was meant for dry goods. It's literally a building of all doors. And so this is the historic facade. At some point, it was renovated. They introduced these long cuts, and also this is somewhere in the 30s or the 40s, the first use of concrete spandrels, one of the first use concrete spandrels. But then slowly the building was boarded up, coated, all the brick was coated. And so this is the existing condition. And so we have been focused on opening the building back up, trying to support the garment workers by creating venues for them to bring their work down to the street, trying to create this visibility so that the ecosystem that used to be in the garment district can somehow be replicated here, meaning that the garment district worked because they were designers and distributors and garment fabric makers and pattern makers and cut and sew people and the dye house people. So this is part of the ecosystem that we are trying to bring to this building, making these cuts in the second floor so that there's more visibility of the kind of work that happens. This is a worm's eye view of the interior street that connects the city side to the water side. So here we are standing on the city side. It's under construction right now. Here we are standing on city side looking out towards the water. This is second floor looking down. And then this is the reverse of that image, ground floor looking up. These are some of the void spaces that we hope will be filled with kind of amenities that the tenants can share and to host events that they could program to support their work and to display their work. So for us, this project and other projects that we've been involved in is interesting because because of environmental reasons, manufacturing has always been zoned along the waterfront. But for obvious reasons, there's a lot of pressure on waterfronts now. We need more public space, we need more housing, but the city is also trying to orchestrate all of this along with keeping some manufacturing. And so for us, this is an opportunity to open up these modes of production and make these work cultures more visible to the public and hopefully participatory in a way that benefits them. Lastly, we've been working on looking at domestic typologies, and this is Carmel Place, which was the winner of the Adapt NYC competition from 2011. And that competition was aimed at addressing the radical demographic shift in our cities, not just New York, of small households. And so this is the site that the mayor's office and city planning chose. It's kind of in this bowl of brick on 27th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue. The city started this competition to address the rise of small households. But the story of the micro unit really starts with Jacob Riis, who turned his cameras onto the working class in 1895. This book was published in 1895. At that time, the working class that was below the poverty level of the city was about 50% of the city. And so he exposed their living conditions, their lack of light and air, lack of proper sanitation, windows, daylight, lack of proper leases. So it's important to understand that all of the housing regulations and Department of Building codes is the result of his work, all the minimum standards for rooms and minimum standards for apartment units. The paradox is that while the American home has been ballooning, almost double the size of the American home in the 50s, the American family has been shrinking, so that the nuclear family is now in the minority. And this is not just a New York City problem. So Manhattan, the amount of single person households is 46%. In overall New York City, it's actually mid 30%. But it is not just a nationwide issue, it's also a global issue, that there's just more and more people living by themselves, whether it's because we are divorcing more, or because women are studying more and therefore starting families later, and also because we are living longer, because we are more healthy. So in New York, we have 1.8 small households, but only 1.8 million small households, but only 1 million suitable small household units. This is city planning taping out. This is not a project, but this is city planning taping out a 300 square foot net small apartment as a test to see whether this is a good idea or not. The other aspect of our project is that it's modular construction, which I believe helped us win. So that was the rendering. And this is upon completion, the 2016 opening. For us, we thought a lot of, and worked on how to make those small units feel good, feel humane and spacious. But we also tackled the idea of, how should living in a building be different? And so we thought about the idea of the dispersed home, that all of the amenities that you might have within your unit, if your unit has been shrunk, those elements are elsewhere in the building. And so we placed the shared amenities in the locations where, as many people would use them as possible. Unfortunately, they took out the gym, but the coffee shop is kind of perfect in that location. We really try to expand all of the shared spaces as much as possible. So this was the gym overlooking Carmel Place, and then here we are in our context. It's kind of like David and Goliath, but I'm showing this to you to explain the choice of brick for our cladding. We had two construction sites, one inside the modular factory and the other in situ on site. So we would look at each unit type and approve it before they released that line of units. And this video is basically the timeline of the factory floor. So you can see the beginning of the unit, which is a steel chassis with concrete poured on top. And then as it is more and more developed, it eventually rolls out, page down, out the door. Oops. And then when the units actually leave the factory, they leave midnight over the Brooklyn Bridge to avoid traffic. When they leave, almost everything is in place, meaning that so it's basically the unit plus a little bit of the corridor. And then the core, the elevator and the stair core was also a prefab unit. This is how it goes together, kind of like Legos. The units themselves are self-supporting, meaning that there is no primary structure. So within the units are 4x4 steel posts, and those kind of lock into each other. So when the units stack, you basically get double floor and ceiling, and double wall construction. So the acoustics are amazing. This is the inside of the unit. For the affordable housing units that went to former vets, they were all furnished. The ceiling height was very good, 9'8". So the average size of the units is 300 square feet net. So that means that we shrank the units by 25% in terms of floor area. But the height of the units is 9'8". So if you compare the volume of a typical new construction unit, which is 400 square feet, 8-foot tall ceilings, we only shrank the volume by 10%. So the units still feel very good. And everybody was surprised because everybody wanted to hate the project because of the micro units, and thought that micro units means that there's something impoverished about the living spaces. But this and all the windows are sliding doors actually, and they hit the ground. And so that leaves for the public lottery. There were 60,000 applications for those 14 units, which I think is terrible, and is an indication of how much we need more affordable housing. So from the exterior, we designed it as a microcosm of the city. The neighbor to the right is clad in white brick. The neighbor to the left is Nisha, dark brick. And so the
Know why the recording is on and off. Perhaps whenever I speak, it should go off, and whenever you speak, it should go on. But I wanted to thank you, and maybe ask the first question or two, and then, rather than my calling on people who are reading quotes from the chat room, if there are people who have questions to ask you, maybe they can just jump right in. But I'd like to start kind of where you did, with the issue of narrative. You talked about books well known, and perhaps in some instances less well known. The narrative of the Equal Rights Center was very, very clear, but it was also a clear narrative coming out of the other technologies that you mentioned, whether they were habitation, Carmel Place with changes in demographics, changes in living patterns, whether they were narrative of means and transparency in production, as you were describing in Sunset Park. And certainly at Jones Beach, where the narrative of climate action was most resonant with our theme here, concerning for sustainable urbanization. I'd like to ask you, and maybe reprising a little bit of our prior conversation, but where does the narrative start, and where or when does it end? There are obviously stakeholder questions that come from the beginning, client concerns, user issues. But I remember you saying last time we spoke during the annual, not too long ago, it seems like a week ago, that narrative never really ends, that there's an ongoing process, an iterative process of discussion and change throughout the design process, and maybe afterwards. You describe the process in terms of how it continues beyond the delivery of a particular building project?
Yeah, I mean, with everyone is different. With Auburn, we once it started shifting away from a visitor center. I mean, even when it was a visitor center, we started with some research into the region. But once it started shifting away from the visitor center, and once we understood that they wanted to focus on the kind of the historic legacy, particularly the political legacy, we started a reading list. And that reading list kind of changed, so first it was more local, and then it just expanded to to be about the Underground Railroad, and the suffragette movement and the LGBTQ movement. And so we started to expand it, and also it was partly out of necessity, because it was a state contract, and we didn't understand that we needed a curator, and by the time they transform the identity of the project into something much more grand, we thought, we need a historian, but we can't add to our contract. So we had to do that work ourselves, which is amazing, you know, and that's what we're interested in anyway, you know, a deep understanding of the context. And then I would say, you know, like what kind of, you know, like those readings just led me to a lot of other readings that were also partly because of school. I teach at Columbia. I teach architecture design studios, and after George Floyd, we had a lot of conversations amongst the faculty, and a lot of just radical kind of reframing of our curriculum. And so that kind of dovetailed into that activity. And then for Jones Beach, in a similar way, you know, because we, you know, in Jones Beach, we actually had an exhibit designer, but we kind of start thinking about it before they are brought on, because for us, it's very much tied to the architecture. So for both Jones Beach and New York State Equal Rights, we co-designed the exhibit. But just the very experience of the exhibit, and, you know, like how things flow, and just the idea of, you know, a building that is about parks and nature, as well as this local power authority and energy, you know, that immediately set up this narrative of, you know, how can this be synergistic rather than antagonistic, and how can the building support different ways of telling this story. So there are exhibits inside, and then, you know, because it's our obsession, you know, like we always want our architecture to kind of reframe the context within which it sits. So, you know, it all of a sudden you have views of the beach, all of a sudden you understand that a lot of the so-called native habitat was actually brought in by Moses. So that all has to do with, you know, how we organize the building, how we reframe the context, how we look back out at the context in different ways through the lens of the mission of our buildings.
You know, today, coincidentally or not, you know, apart from the architectural holidays we're celebrating, also would have been the, I guess, the 72nd birthday of Zaha Hadid, who said the beauty of the landscape, where sand, water, reeds, birds, buildings, and people all somehow flow together, has never left me. I grew up not too far from Jones Beach, and our friends that are active. You know, I won't say that's not enough for you. It's somewhere very deep down, and we'll get there. And now there's an incentive. The project has won all sorts of awards recently. I won't list them all, but they're all on your website, and it celebrates a connection between nature and habitation, ability to be inside and see things. What I found remarkable in the photos, and again, I apologize for not having been out there yet to see it in person, was things that you mentioned, is the simplification, you know, of the process of construction, but stripping down the architecture to the essentials. It seems to me that is a hallmark of the practice across the board, and that even at Carmel Place, which seemed complicated in comparison, you know, the modular construction methodology was a simplification because it confined and defined, circumscribed the space that you were creating. How do you start with different types of projects, and looking again at the website, there are all different types of typologies. You're not repeating yourself particularly in any one project. How do you start with the idea that something has to meet all sorts of complicated, expensive, interrelated, but still different needs, and keep it so simple and so elegant, so wonderful?
That's 99% of our work. How to keep it simple. In the case of Carmel Place, the developer, the general contractor, and the modular company was all started by the same guy. And when we were invited to join them for the HPD's RFP, that was the constraint. So we actually started that project by looking at the construction documents of their modular system. We didn't, like, and then we looked at zoning, so the simple answer is that first we look at all of the constraints and we try to lay out all of the constraints. And from, construction modular, details to everything else. And then we are, doing, most of our work is trying to, craft it together into not a list of things that we respond to, but towards something that is bigger. And for us, that comes through in
The chat.
sites
Sorry.
and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to the chat room to see if anyone did want to raise their hand or and ask a question, because I have many other things I want to talk about, but I don't want to preclude other people from having the chance to. And for that matter, Julio, if you would like to ask a question here, we were looking forward to sitting around the table. I told my students that you'd be here and not, so we got Julio's here anyway, but not to put you on the spot. Are there people in the audience who have questions before I continue?
Actually, I like the part of the modular construction. I'm not an architect, I'm a structural engineer. So yeah, I like a lot of your presentation about the fourth project, the Carmel Place, I think. I'm more interested in that structural side. So how do you actually consider, because the building work as a whole also, not only as a modular, how can you say, modular elements, right? So for example, we have to consider wind, we have to consider any other factors that affect the building as a whole and not as a module, because you said also that each module were self-supported. So yes, my question is that how, did you consider the behavior of the building as a whole, or just as self-supported module?
Definitely as a whole. The system, we simply worked with what the modular manufacturer had already developed, which was the system of, a steel chassis with vertical 4x4 posts. And that is within the thickness of the walls, right? And that just gets kind of, sandwiched next to the other one. So definitely as a whole, the whole thing is evaluated. In terms of structure, it was simple. What was very difficult was all of the permitting, because permitting is really behind modular construction, particularly UL rating. So for example, we had double walls and double floors, but because that exact system had not been approved by UL, it took us a long time to get the UL approvals, So that and then the permitting was also tricky, because again, it's very new and DOB is very unfamiliar with modular. So it was more the regulatory aspects that were very challenging. But in terms of the design of systems, it wasn't anything that complicated, really. It was just the kind of, making sure that, for example, I show you the plan. All of the chases are on the corridor side of the unit, and they left the drywall open when they stacked the units together. Otherwise, all the other drywall was already in place. And they left it open in order to basically do all the connections between the floors, even though all the pipes and all the ducts were already within the unit, right? But between units, all of those connections happened on site. So, it took us a while to understand the logistics and the sequencing of the work.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also wanted to thank you for bringing the impact that George Floyd and the discussions of the day had on the architecture, engineering, and construction communities. I think discussions of contemporary and historic context as you work and conversations with the community have changed forever as a function of changed consciousness about who stakeholders are and who buildings are for. The corollary crisis, apart from the climate crisis that brings us here together, consortium, has been the impact of the pandemic. And it occurs to me that whether we're talking about of COVID-19 and the pandemic, whether talking about manufacturing and where jobs are, what types of jobs exist, live workspace, changes in patterns of habitation. In some way, your work, your firm's work, has addressed demographic and lifestyle changes that have occurred in New York and, as you said, around the world elsewhere. As we talked a little bit before about units getting smaller, you have people working at home. What intrigued me this time more than I remembered from our prior discussion during the biennial was the transparency of the work process out in Sunset Park. And my family, my father, my grandfather were all worked in the garment district, and the ability to see what was going on, not just in the storefront distribution, but in the things that were rolling down the street. The garment center as a center of production and distribution design was just a phenomenal melting pot, different cultures, all very, very visible. I don't get that in Sunset Park quite. So I'd like to ask you to elaborate on the issue of transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tall order, what they're trying to do, because trying to replicate the social and economic networks of an entire city neighborhood, right? So, and all around us are other pressures that make that more difficult. Including work that the EDC is also bringing in. So, on the same campus, they're bringing in sound stages because they're interested in the 4 Fs: fabrication, fashion, film, and I forget what the other F is, but those are the 4 Fs of manufacturing that they're trying to keep. So it is going to be very difficult because they are kind of weighing their capacity to develop projects versus giving land to developers. So for instance, we are working on North Bush Terminal, South Bush Terminal campus. They issued an RFP, and that has been released to a developer, and the whole thing is going to be for film. And that is the kind of catch-22, because when Steiner Studio entered the Navy Yard, they single-handedly kind of raised the rent on everybody. So I think it's a much broader conversation about the survival of garment versus film, because film, what happened in the Navy Yard was that, the Navy Yard went from fabrication, woodworkers and metal fabricators to film studios. And then, tech came in, and the rents are now unaffordable for fabricators.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's tricky because the garment, fabric people are also very secretive about their lines, their textile lines and, et cetera, et cetera. So, we were actually pushing for a lot more kind of shared amenities space, actually, because we thought, hey, they need a photo studio. Like all of the designers in the building need a photo studio, why don't we sneak one in somewhere? And so we were only able to keep it on the second and the first floor because, and that was more kind of, EDC's interest in bringing in a kind of fashion school to maybe take over some of those spaces. But when they spoke to the garment people, some of them were fine with more transparency. Some of them were really not okay with the idea. They wanted to keep it more secretive.
I'm afraid that we're out of time. There are two questions now from members of the audience that I would love to spend a minute or two, maybe just asking very, very briefly. Efrem Schluger is asking about CO2 reduction, maybe in general in projects. And I'm assuming that comes from both materials and systems, but short answer, how one or more of your projects address?
Yeah, I would say materials and systems. To be honest with you, we haven't calculated it yet because it's really complicated. And unfortunately, most clients do not want to engage the services of somebody to calculate that, because that's like, much more complicated than complying with or net zero, etc.
Yeah.
Our reduction of materials, reduction of systems, reduction of different trade is how we try to do it. I'm trying to read the second question.
Yeah, it was several parts, but I think the first part had to do with the reduction in the unit size from 400 to 300 square feet. And if the pandemic had an impact on, on your thinking, or perhaps, all of our thinking on whether micro units work or not.
We are not, here to sell you micro units and only micro units. I actually think that intergenerational housing and the ability to, recognize that households change in number and makeup as one ages in life is really important. So I think that, designing intergenerational housing, the capacity to bring in an in-law or a grandparent or somebody, some sort of flexibility, and that code does not like those things, but I know that there are conversations about that, where, can you annex? Can you have like joker wildcard apartments in a building, for people to stay short term? That kind of thing is, I think, really necessary. And then outdoor space.
That's forever changed. Well, again, I want to thank you, and I also want to thank everyone who stayed with us through the discussion, and also thank the partners of the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization in this series, this monthly series. They include UN Habitat, AIA New York chapter, and particularly the Planning and Design Committee of the AIA New York, NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, Habitat Professional Forum for Sustainable Cities, the Creative Exchange Labs, CEL, GUD, Global Development, and lastly, but not least, the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space here at Columbia. Today is World Cities Day. We're celebrating that along with Halloween. And I'll just conclude, if I might, with one last quote from someone else whose birthday is today, John Keats, who died young. I think he was 26. He was born in 1795 on October 31st. He said, "The poetry of the earth is never dead." And I would like to think that it pertains to everything that you and Eric are doing together and all of us in our firm. So thank you, Mimi, so much.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye. Take care.